So that was really a huge red flag. And I remember law enforcement bringing me in and sitting me down, and that, there was a real fear for my safety, especially because I was such a public figure in my community. I think as we kind of look back on this case, one of the former judges who's now retired said, she's like, it's not a matter. I mean, it's so debilitating, and just the depression that comes around it, just everything. I just felt like I saw this quote the other day by the stalking expert. I believe his name's Patrick Brady, and it summed it up so well. It said, stalking is homicide in slow motion. And I'd never seen it that way before. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's completely accurate. Because it is just slowly killing you. And you come to this place where, I was definitely suicidal several times over this, because I just thought I was never going to be free. Like, I'm never going to be rid of this. So what am I supposed to do?
Anna Nasset has been stalked since 2011 by a man she didn't even know.
She doesn't know how he became fixated and obsessed with her, but when he did, she had to drastically change her life.
Her stalker forced her to live in fear. She lost her business and eventually moved across the country to get away from him.
I'm Jamie Beebe.
And I'm Jake Deptula.
On today's episode of Strictly Stalking, we will hear from Anna Nasset and how her stalker destroyed her life for years, until she fought back and became an advocate for others in the same situation.
Welcome to the show, Anna. Can you tell us how everything began for you?
Yes. So in 2011, I was living out in Washington State in a wonderful little town called Port Townsend, Washington. And I owned an art gallery, which was like my dream in life, was to own an art gallery. And that was what I planned to do for the rest of my life. And one evening I was getting my gallery window ready for a gallery walk the next day. And it was dark out, maybe 6 or 7 in the evening, and a man approached my business and knocked on the door. And I was in the window, so he was right next to me, basically, with just the glass in between. And I popped down and opened the door just a little bit and asked him what he wanted. He introduced himself, said that he had made a small painting for me because he fancies himself an artist, and gave me this gift. I said, thank you. He said he wanted to submit images to me to possibly show at my gallery. So I gave him my business card, and that was it. And closed the door and really thought nothing of it. Went home, and it was about the next day I started receiving messages from him. Like, initially was, kind of a somewhat professional, wanting to show his artwork. So submitted his portfolio to me. But quickly the language shifted. And became either, it was kind of chaotic. It would be talking about my appearance and then just asking general art questions. And so just immediately my gut went, something's not right here. This isn't the way I've ever had an artist communicate with me in the past, and just wasn't really sure quite what to do at that time. So I responded to one message he sent me, and then I never responded to anything else he sent me as it continued to escalate. Oh yeah, I used to get 5 to 10 people would come in a week wanting to show artwork at my gallery. So it was nothing out of the normal. Those first messages, it was the language he used, especially like commenting on my appearance and how attractive he thought I was. And then there was just a chaoticness to the messaging. And in those initial messages within that first week, he wrote to me that the painting he had made for me was titled Marry Me. And then went on to say that he didn't know if he wanted to marry me, but that he might want to. And so that was a huge, just like, what's going on here? There's something not right. And then he started to also write in the messages about seeing me. Like, it was great to see you today, but I never had seen him. So that was another, like, it was him being like, I'm watching you. I can see where you're at. And I had no knowledge that he was anywhere.
Almost as soon as the stalking began, her life started drastically changing.
She was so terrified of her stalker that she basically became a prisoner in her own home, and the effect on her business was devastating.
Immediately it affected my business. Like, just almost immediately it affected my business because I worked alone. It was November, which is a really dark month in Washington State. Like, the sun sets at 4:30. So it was dark. I just felt like I was just kind of the sitting duck. So I started closing my business early, really had a hard time selling art or jewelry that I had on display because I was so focused on looking outside to see if he was out there. I started walking in my car with, pretending to be on the phone with a friend, just different things to create any sort of like safety around me. As time went on, I would have people come and sit in the gallery with me if I was really feeling fearful or if I saw him on the street. So just the biggest thing was that initial hit to my business, which continued as this went on. Yeah, suddenly you just feel like you're in this, like you're getting locked into this little jail. And I mean, I think that's so much of what stalking is they're trying to put you into this jail and into this prison. And not maybe necessarily physically, but mentally, they're putting you into a prison.
Like anyone in her situation, Anna decided to find out exactly who it was that she was dealing with.
He's a 37-year-old man named Fraser Rochford who has a long, disturbing history of harassing women.
His first stalking case began before 2009 when he started following and sending letters to a former high school classmate.
And when he was convicted for felony harassment in 2009, he began stalking the therapist and counselors he was working with at the behavioral health center.
He also began stalking a district prosecuting attorney and a corrections officer.
Over the years, Fraser Rochford had 12 prior convictions for stalking and harassment. He had 16 protection orders and spent a total of 55 months incarcerated.
But this did nothing at all to deter him from continuing to stalk and victimize women.
Let's hear what else Anna learned about her stalker and what happened when she got law enforcement involved.
So pretty quickly, I did a Google search on him and saw some past articles about he has paranoid schizophrenia, and so saw some articles about criminal cases he brought up in the past with our mental health department in the community. So that was a huge tip-off that something was probably even more wrong than I initially suspected. And then I called a friend of mine who, an older gentleman, he was very involved with all the law enforcement in town and everything like that. And I asked him if he knew who this individual was, and he immediately replied, "You need to go to the police right now." And so that was, your kind of information gathering as you go along. And I did go to the police that same day and was met by an amazing officer, Officer Bill Corrigan, and he just was so kind and empathetic and professional and sat me down and was like, this man is known for like some other little small crimes in the community. He was known to get fixated on people for short amounts of time, but then generally he would shift focus. So usually it was like a couple of months he would be fixated on somebody and then he would switch focus. So all of those things kind of informed me enough to go, okay, I do have a problem, but it's probably not going to last long. And I started filing my reports with the law enforcement and just doing whatever I could. Because ultimately, like in this situation of stalking, you are your own advocate, and it's up to you to collect the data, to investigate your own case. So, kept starting to keep logs of everything and, document everything. Every time he sent me a message, screenshot it, and just start collecting all of that data so that I could continue to give that to law enforcement. I really credit Officer Corrigan for when I first went in saying, like, you need to keep all of this, you need to document all of this. So I would say that he informed me on how to, in essence, build my own case. And for me, that was huge. And I just kind of followed what they told me to do. And so really I walked into the right police station with the right police officer.
She really did luck out because all too often we hear law enforcement just doesn't take it seriously.
And because they took this continuous harassment seriously, the authorities took action and moved forward to prosecute and secure a restraining order right away.
But the jail time and restraining order did not stop Anna's stalker for very long.
Let's hear from Anna what happened next.
So, we had that initial prosecution in 2012. I got a protection order at that time as well. And so he served 364 days in jail and got out in, I guess it would be January 2013. And From there, things were kind of a little bit quiet. I had moved into a new apartment, and I very specifically chose an apartment that was within 500 feet of my gallery because I had a 500-foot protection order. So I thought, okay, hopefully, like when he gets out of jail, he'll leave me alone. But if nothing else, at least I've got this 500-foot world that I can live in. And he didn't really come after me right away. I think it was within a couple of months, he started writing letters and sending them to our local police station. And in those letters, he started to talk about what an evil person I was and all of the ways in which evil people should die. And so that was really a huge red flag. And I remember law enforcement bringing me in and sitting me down, and that, there was a real fear for my safety, especially because I was such a public figure in my community. I think as we kind of look back on this case, one of the former judges who's now retired said, she's like, it's not a matter of if he's going to kill, it's a matter of when. And
Wow.
So there was a real concern, especially, the first Saturday of every month, I would have these gallery walks where there would be a couple hundred people would come through. And so there was a real concern that he could potentially do a much larger act of violence that would be more damaging, not just to me, but to the community as far as safety. We just were doing whatever we could. Like, the cops can't necessarily give you preferential treatment, so it wasn't like they could, protect me as like bodyguards or anything, but they just really helped me understand how to navigate this, how to find safety. When there were times that was really bad, they would have me go stay at friends' houses, this and that, and just do whatever I could to continue on.
How difficult was it to get that first restraining order?
It was very easy because it was the same time as he got prosecuted. And so the judge was just like, yes, he's being prosecuted for stalking, and this is the woman he's stalking. And I should mention he does have 3 other victims over the last many years as well. And so she gave me that initial protection order, and eventually a couple of years later gave me a lifetime protection order against him. And then they changed it again and gave me a lifetime protection order against him that is 150 miles. So he's not to be within 150 miles of me.
Wow. And so when he got out then after the 364 days and he was writing to the police about you, that wasn't a violation?
It was not. And I mean, I think the thing with stalkers is they're generally pretty intelligent. And so he knew how to navigate it in this very specific way. Like, he didn't say, I'm going to kill Anna by these specific ways. He said she should be killed. So because he didn't use that language of that, he wasn't directly threatening me, even though he knew within the language that he couldn't get arrested for that because he didn't say he was going to. And he also wasn't sending these letters directly to me. So if he had sent them to me, it would have been a violation.
Right. And do you think he was still following you at this time?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There was a lot of just strange things that would happen. At one point, I lived in a little apartment building, and there was only 3 other units in it. And at one point, he actually tried to rent one of the units, which is obviously not at all a coincidence. There was times, as the years went on, I ended up living in a different apartment and, of course, didn't list my address or anything, and would become really specific when I rented places. I always wanted to have 2 entrances so that if he came in one entrance, I could get out the other one. I wanted a locked building. I wanted a place where my car could be hidden. So I rented this apartment that had a carport in the back. I was very private about where I lived, and I always would do, like, once a month, I would look at his social media from a secure computer just to kind of monitor if he was up to anything or if there was anything about me. And one time, I looked on there and he'd posted all these pictures of my apartment building. And it's just not coincidence. So those things kept happening. But he was kind of quiet for a couple of years. He'd kind of ebb in and out of what he was doing. And one problem for me that I would have, and sometimes it would lead to me not reporting, like times if, he wouldn't leave the grocery store when I went in there, and he would end up hiding kind of around displays and following me. And a lot of times I wouldn't report because I didn't want to get back into this, the legal system. And also it was quickly discovered that whenever I reported or brought in the legal system, he thought that was a sign of my love for him. And so therefore I would sometimes choose not to report just because I didn't want to deal with it. I mean, I started grocery shopping at like odd hours. Cause at one point he didn't have a vehicle, and I knew when the public bus system ran. So it's like I would go grocery shopping when I knew he wouldn't be there or when I hoped he wouldn't be there. Just everything about I would never walk anywhere by myself, like not even a couple of blocks. Because the one time I did walk a couple blocks by myself to meet up with friends, there he was. So I just started to really, really isolate, and I ended up losing my business in 2013 because of all of this. Like the toll just was too much to be able to keep it open. And yeah, I just kind of started feeling like I was locked into this tiny little prison in my apartment, and just didn't feel like I had any freedom, and was just anxiety ridden beyond anything. I mean, I still deal with a lot of anxiety issues from all of this, and just try to do the best I could. But eventually I ended up moving. So.
Well, so this forced you to move.
Yeah. I had an experience in, 2015. I'm originally from Ohio, and my father, unfortunately, was diagnosed with cancer, and it was evidence that it was going to be a very quick cancer. And so I went home to be with my parents for about 2 months. And during that time when I was home, suddenly I could go to the grocery store without being afraid. I would walk my parents' trails at night. I could go into town and meet up with a friend for a drink, and all these things that had been taken from my life that I wasn't doing, suddenly I could do again with a place of freedom. And after my father passed away and I went back to Washington, I knew I was going to have to leave if I wanted any freedom. And so as I was making that decision and coming to terms with that, he ended up taking me to court to try and get the protection order revoked, because his thing was he hadn't tried to communicate with me in a while. And I think he went on to say, I'll always love her, but I haven't tried to communicate with her lately. So I ended up having to go to court, and the judge threw it out and basically said to him, if you try this again, I'll have you arrested for breaking the protection order. And oftentimes that's what stalkers do, is they'll use the legal system to be able to interact with you, because that's one way they can do it, because they do have rights. And so I found that to be the case. And after that, I was just done. I'm like, I can't be here anymore. So I moved here to Vermont in 2016. I mean, it's so debilitating, and just the depression that comes around it, just everything. I just felt like I saw this quote the other day by the stalking expert. I believe his name's Patrick Brady, and it summed it up so well. It said, stalking is homicide in slow motion. And I'd never seen it that way before. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's completely accurate. Because it is just slowly killing you. And you come to this place where, I was definitely suicidal several times over this, because I just thought I was never going to be free. Like, I'm never going to be rid of this. So what am I supposed to do? So yeah, it was so painful to move away, and I just have such a beautiful community and friendships back there. But it was what I needed to do to try and find safety. Other than just losing my art gallery, which was obviously very significant, One thing that people don't think about is if you're a victim of stalking, those around you don't think you're safe. Because what if he came and attacked you at work? So you become some sort of kind of a liability. And I've handled that in different ways. The jobs I've had, I have eventually had to tell my employers, like, you don't tell your employer when you're getting hired, thank you so much for this job, but just so you know, got this guy who stalks me. He thinks that we're in love, but he also wants to murder me. Like, no one's going to hire you. So I have had to tell employers as time has gone on. And one job specifically out here in Vermont, I ended up losing in time because of it. Because it got to a point within this where he figured out where I was here in Vermont and was like, I'm going to come be with you. And so at that point, it was my duty to tell my bosses, because what if something did happen? So, that loss of job is so significant. And also, you end up being so out of your head that you aren't a good worker. Like, I missed work. I wasn't present. All of these things because I was so distracted in such a place of fear. So that's been a really hard thing of how you can still be a successful employee if that's your situation. And I think the same thing with like housing. It's hard to find housing if people know your situation, because they don't want to rent to you if, something horrible could happen there.
For sure.
And so it really limits every aspect of your life, and you have to learn how to navigate it.
Because of the constant harassment from her stalker, Anna lost her business, her home, and almost her life.
She felt she had no other choice than to move away from her stalker to become free from him.
But moving away really ended up just giving her a false sense of freedom, because as long as he was out there and hunting for her, she would never really be free.
Let's hear how Anna eventually took matters into her own hands and fought back against her stalker.
I think I will always look over my shoulder. I think I will always be on high alert. I'd like to say that I won't be, but I just think after all these years of dealing with this, those things don't just go away. And I was incredibly private about where I moved to. And so I thought, okay, great, I'm going to be safe and clear. But I also came here thinking I would just kind of disappear. I would just get a little job. Nobody would need to know who I was. And I would just try and start a quiet life over. But that didn't last very long. So, because within a couple of months, within about 4 months of me being here, I actually went back to Washington very quietly for a visit. And while I was there, he started messaging me again and writing to me. And it was vile. It was horrific and disgusting, just the different things that he was writing to me. And so that was October 2016 and went on into February 2017.
But this was a violation of the restraining order then, right?
Yes, it was. And so that's when they started to really begin to build this bigger case, because now we could go after felony charges. So that was almost a little over right around 3 years ago. And, I'm getting so many messages from him. I'm back here in Vermont, but I'm filing them all with Officer Corrigan out in Washington. And the first prosecuting attorney decided that because I lived so far away, he wasn't going to pursue it. And then the offender ended up being in a different town, and he was continuing to write to me. So this took a long time for them to figure out, and they had to do, I've gotten search warrants by Facebook and all of these different things to figure out and pinpoint his exact location. And they determined that his exact location was in a different county, and the prosecuting attorney in that county decided to pursue this case. During these couple of years of them building it, he ended up getting arrested for the stalking of this other woman and served time in jail for that. And so during that time while he was in jail was when they really started to build this case. And they were incredible. The prosecuting attorney, James Kennedy, is amazing. He was just like, this is going to be so hard to prove because stalking never gets prosecuted, but I'm going to fight for you. and there ended up being 2 prosecuting attorneys on the case, and just an incredible victim coordinator out there in Washington, and the other detectives that got involved. Like, everyone they just fought for me, and I couldn't believe they were doing it because I was so far away. They'd never met me, and they just kept building this. And we eventually did go to trial 6 months ago, just not even 6 months ago.
Had you teamed up with the other girls then, or was it just your case?
It was just my case because they had the most evidence by going with just me. They did bring in the other women. They all testified so that we could go after the aggravated. So they were going with the charges of felony cyber stalking and felony stalking with the aggravated. The other longtime victim, we've gotten together and become very good friends. We do have similarities in parts of our appearance, I would say. And so I think he started stalking her about maybe before he started stalking me. It's all very fuzzy because I don't really know how long this has started. I'll share more about that in a minute. But the other 2 women, there's not really any similarities, but they both work in the criminal justice system. So as he started getting arrested more, he started to be like, well, I can't get out of jail, so I'm going to start stalking this woman who's actually, working in the jail. So that's kind of how that continued on.
Wow.
So trial was 6 months ago, and there was a lot of prep work leading up to it. It took the team out there, and I call the attorneys and everybody out there my team. The team out there worked really hard to just keep me in the loop of every single hearing there was, of competency hearings, just everything that was happening. And then before we went to trial, James Kennedy, the prosecuting attorney, sent me the entire direct of questions he was going to be asking me, just everything. And I ended up working with an advocate out here in Vermont, Amy Farr. She works for the Attorney General's office. And so her and I met for hours and hours and worked on prep, went through all the questions, just tried to do the very best they could to prepare me. Because unfortunately, the offender also decided to defend himself. Once again, how stalkers use the criminal justice or the legal system to be able to stalk their victims. So I wasn't only preparing to go testify, I was preparing to have to actually talk to him. And that was not easy. It was a very, very difficult time. And I just remember thinking, I can't even get on this plane. Like, how am I going to put one foot in front of the other to get on the plane, let alone go in there and sit and testify with him in the room? Yeah, I remember like the second day, I ended up testifying for about 8 hours, which is a very long time. James Kennedy afterwards said he'd never had somebody on the stand for that long. Yeah, the second day when I was going to have to actually answer questions and be cross-examined by the stalker, that morning I was sitting in like this conference room getting ready, just sitting there trying to prepare. And I looked at James, the attorney, and I said, I think this might be the worst day of my life. And he's like, oh, no, it's not going to be. I was like, you know what? If it is, I'm okay with that because I know I'm going to get through it. I know somehow I'm going to get through this, even though this is like my worst nightmare. I'm going to make it through. And I did. And it was really hard, like the entire time testifying. Every time I would try and answer a question, he would object. He would talk over. So, I mean, it was so hard to keep my frame of mind. I was physically ill. I was, throwing up in the bathroom every break we had and just completely raw. I ended up having a bucket up in the little booth next to me just in case I needed to throw up. And yeah, it was hell. That's what I can definitely say.
Not only did Anna have to go through years of torment from her stalker, but then to have to face him defending himself in court is unreal.
It changed her life in so many ways, but ultimately it made her a survivor. Let's hear how she got through it.
I feel like I conjured up some primal anger inside of me and just came out like with laser focused clarity. I never looked at him. I was like, I'm not going to even look at you. So I just either looked at the judge or looked at my prosecuting attorney the whole time and just answered questions. And I think because of that, he was really thrown off because I wasn't going to give him anything. I'm just like, you get nothing from me. And so pretty quickly, his line of questioning really derailed to where he was saying things like that I was in charge of 9/11 happening, that he went all over the place. He went into like my role within the Catholic Church's sexual assault, I believe, talking about how I was in charge of all these different terrorist attacks. Like it went way off really quickly. He started out pretty clearly, but he went off really quickly. And one of the hardest things for me was when he first started questioning me, he started asking about my work before I had the gallery and the location of my work and that location next to how close it was to where his father's office was. And as he's asking these questions, it became apparent that he was letting me know that he'd been watching me since then. So not since 2011, since like 2008 or 2009. And that was really, really challenging to hold my composure while having that information come into my head from his mouth, like as all of this is happening.
Yeah, I mean, that would just make my stomach drop to know that it had been going on so much longer and you didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, it was terrifying. I do remember that when I finished testifying, the trial was a bench trial, so it was just seen in front of the judge. There was no jury. And so they kind of took me off into the jury's room, and I just fell onto the ground, like just sobbing, like couldn't even handle it. It's like this just took everything out of me. And I think that's probably the reaction a lot of us have, whether it's stalking or sexual assault, to having to be in that room with this person who's just abused us. So amazingly, he was convicted, which very, very rarely happens, as you all know.
Absolutely.
And as I'm sure your listeners are finding out. So he was convicted of the felony stalking with the aggravated and felony cyber stalking. And that was amazing. So sentencing was a month later, which is pretty typical. And I was back here in Vermont. Luckily, I didn't have to go back to Washington for it. But I did prepare a victim impact statement and appear over the phone and read that. And he ended up being sentenced to the maximum of 10 years. Who knows how much of that he'll actually serve. But so that was really incredible to have that happen. And even within that, I don't remember. I kind of went out of body with it when we got that sentence. But I do remember the judge saying things like, you know, the reason I'm giving the maximum is that he shows no remorse. He is continuing to commit the crime, even in the courtroom. And he talked a lot about how difficult it is. The judge said things like, you know, usually when I'm hearing a case, I see physical evidence. I see physical injury. I see, you know, damage to property, whatever it might be. He's like, here, I'm just looking at like the psychological evidence of this crime and the psychological impact. And he's like, and it is very much there. And so I really commend Judge Basden is his name. I really commend him for seeing that and sentencing in that way.
Anna has an amazing story of survival, facing the monster that had been stalking her and finally put him away.
Not only did she fight back and put him away, but she now works in victim services so she can help others.
My real hope is that my case isn't the exception, that it starts to be the standard. And I think, you know, the work that you all are doing with this podcast, the work that I do, the work that other people who have been on your show are out there doing is like we're all pushing for this to be taken seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even what you mentioned before, when you started your organization, Stand Up Resources, what was the point when you were like, okay, you know, people need to know what I've gone through, and also people need to know how to get help?
Yes. So I because of everything that had happened, I really had a heart to move my career into victim services. And my background is, owning an art gallery and then also like marketing, graphic design. So I thought I would end up working for an organization and doing that more development type stuff. And in order to kind of figure out my place, I took this course here in Vermont. Most states have them. Here it's the Vermont Victim Assistance Academy. It's put on by the state. And so I started taking that just to figure out, like, what am I doing? How do I fit into this world? I don't really know what else to do now. And I'll ask me in a little bit about losing jobs because I'll talk to you about that. But so I started taking this academy and met with somebody who was the director of it. And she was like, we all need someone who does development. So you should start a business and be able to work for everyone. I was like, oh, that's a great idea. That's what I'll do. And she started to talk to me more, and I told her why I'd moved to Vermont. And she was like, have you ever considered speaking? I was like, absolutely not. There's no way. Like, no one needs to know about this. Nobody does know about this. I'd rather them not. And she encouraged me. And so I ended up sitting on this little panel and giving like a 10-minute talk, and then just had such a response from it of people going, we need to hear this. Like, victim service providers need to hear this. Law enforcement needs to hear this. Advocates need to hear this so that they can better understand how to work with victims of stalking. And that just kind of launched it. And I just sort of went for it. It's still pretty bizarre to me that that's what I'm doing. But I love the work, and I love that this thing that's taken everything from me is now giving to me and giving to others. I mean, it's definitely make lemonade out of your lemons type of situation. Sometimes I will kind of provide people some guidance, but my biggest thing is I'm not an advocate. I'm not a professional. All I can say is, like, this is what worked for me. And I honestly, too, feel like that's not my strength. My strength lies in this training people who are serving the victims. So I do a little bit of that and try and offer support. But also, I'm so fresh out of this. I mean, I'm calling this, after the sentencing, I called it my decade of freedom. Yeah. And so I'm only a couple months into my decade of freedom. And so for me, I don't feel like I'm in that place or space where I should be taking that work on right now.
And do you actually feel free right now?
Interesting question. Justice is a funny thing. I'd been warned that, like, there's a pretty big fallout from it. And it's true. Like, I mean, on one level, sure, I do feel free. But on another level, like, it just sucks what we had to do to get there. And it just sucks, like, how much loss there was to get to this point where I have freedom. And, I kind of, when I wrote my impact statement, one of the things I said to the judge, I was like, you are sentencing me to freedom today. Like, you're sentencing him to prison, but you're sentencing me to freedom. And how long are you going to give me for freedom? And so I think in one way, yes. Like, I've taken walks by myself, things that I hadn't done in a really long time, but it's still really, really hard. And there was definitely, just like I said, a huge fallout from going through the trial. I ended up going to Maine for 3 weeks just to be by myself. I was like, I just need to go sit on the water by myself and grieve this and come out the other side. So yes and no, I feel free. I don't, because it's still not over.
Let's hear from Anna what advice she has for others who are out there living in the same situation she was in.
Trust your gut. You are not overreacting. There is help out there. One thing, I often, every time I speak or share, someone comes up to me afterwards and says, I went to the police, or I went to, like, the domestic violence shelter in my community, and they said there was nothing they could do for me. And that's not true. They're there for you. And so one thing I've said to people now lately is, like, tell them that they have to help you. And if they don't know how, why don't you learn together? How do we continue to take this seriously? And so for anybody out there going through this, like, you are not alone. and you deserve to live a beautiful, free life. And you deserve to have the people who are just doing their job, like police officers, like advocates, like judges, believe you and help to work for your freedom.
What kind of precautions can people take? I mean, I know we've talked a lot about, in other episodes, not geotagging on social media, things like that. But, in your case, like, you weren't doing that.
I think, putting your phone down and, not putting your location, stuff like that is obviously a huge one. Just being really aware. Like, when I go back to saying trust your gut, like being aware of your surroundings, being aware of where you're at, letting somebody know where you're at, whether that be if you're, on a date or something like that. Like, I let people know if I'm going to take a walk, like, this is where I'm going, this is when I'll be back. So really keeping people aware of what you're doing, but not on social media aware of what you're doing. Like, just the actual people in your life, let them know what's happening with you. Yeah, awareness of your surroundings, trust your gut. And also, if there is a problem for yourself, if you feel like you're being stalked, or if a friend of yours is, like, believe them and, follow the course of action that we're talking about here of reporting and keeping your logs and doing all of these different things. And I think for so many of us, it's like, it doesn't really matter if it was a stranger who's stalking you, like in my case, or if it's somebody that you were in a relationship with, which is what we know is the majority of stalking, that there's nothing about this that's your fault. There's nothing that you could have done differently. And that's something people ask me, and it drives me nuts when they ask me, like, could you have done something differently? I'm like, no. What was I supposed to do? Not live my life? Like, this just happened to happen to me. So I think really just knowing that this isn't your fault and accessing those resources and building the community around you. Like, for me, my support system started with friends and family and then grew from there. So having those people around you that you can really trust to be there for you and to support you and to help you find safety.
Thank you so much, Anna, for sharing your story with us today. We're so glad you fought back and put your stalker behind bars.
And thank you for all that you are doing to help others navigate through this same situation.
To learn more about what Anna does in her story, please visit standupresources.com.
If anyone out there is in need of help or is a victim of stalking, please reach out. You can find a list of resources on our Instagram at StrictlyStalkingPod.
I'm Jake Deptula.
And I'm Jamie Beebe. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Strictly Stalking.